All right, so thank you, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Monterey's Magical History Tour. Today's kind of a little experiment. I actually put this program together in September for a group of museum people from Washington State who were visiting Monterey, and they wanted a little history of Monterey. And those of you who've been on my other programs, you know, I tend to focus a lot on fishing history, which I believe is the history of Monterey, but Monterey is much bigger than that. And so we do focus some on fishing today, and maybe you'll hear some things I've talked about before, but I hope there's some new stuff here for you too. Now, by the way, I found this postcard. This is from the 1930s. I love this postcard of Monterey. I'm sure all of us have gone down and spent time on the beach, right? That nice, warm, 55-degree Monterey Bay. So I leave my email address up there. Anytime anybody has any questions about Monterey history, if you don't get it at the end of the program, feel free to email me at any time. So let's go. We're going to start. Let's see if I get this right here. So Monterey has a long history, really dating back to about 10,000 years. And the native people of Monterey, who were the Rumsien people, and we can trace, as I said, a native culture into the Monterey about 10,000 years or so. And if you think about what Monterey may have looked like 1,000 years ago, or really just even 500 years ago, it was a land of lots of lakes, lots of fresh water, at least not to sustain this population, because it was never really that big. Huge herds of deer and elk and tule elk and grizzly bears. And I have read accounts of early explorers come into the Monterey area, especially in the fall months, talking about bird life. So many birds, they said, you couldn't see the surface of the lake, that the ducks would darken the sky. Look out to the bay out there, it'd be so filled with seals and sea lions and stellar sea lions and sea otters. They actually thought that the bay was paved. They wrote in their diaries that the Monterey Bay is like a brown cobblestone. And certain times of the year, waves would crash up onto the beach, pouring fish onto the beach. That's how abundant it was for these folks who lived in the Monterey area at that time. This is a wonderful drawing of a Rumsien woman done by an unknown Spanish artist in the 1790s. And what I love about this drawing is it really does show you their connection to the sea here, to the bay here. So the inner skirt that she's wearing would be made of tules. Tules are those big tall grasses, those reeds that grow along the wetlands. The outer skirt is deer hide, and then these black spots you see here would be actually large abalone pendants. The cape that she is wearing is probably sea otter pelt. And then the necklace she's wearing here is a olivella shell, a sea snail. And then she's got an earpiece right here. We'll take a look at a close-up. This is what she's wearing in her ear, is this piece you see right here. So this is a photograph that I took a couple of years ago, a few years ago, actually, in London at the British Museum, actually in their storage area. They took us to the special place outside of the museum. And this was actually collected in Monterey around the same time that drawing was done by a pretty well-known British explorer named George Vancouver. And you can see it's partly woven like a basket. In fact, at one time, there are acorn woodpecker feathers in this weave here. These large white beads you see are actually olivella shell or clamshell disc beads here. These little white beads are olivella shell bead. There's some glass trade beads here. And of course, here's our abalone pendants right here. And the abalone played a very important part of the life of the Rumsien people. I mean, they ate it. They used the shells to decorate baskets, to make jewelry. They made tools like shovels and bowls and fish hooks, all kinds of things. The word abalone actually comes from the Rumsien people. I mean, abalone is a universal word today used all over the world. And the Rumsien had a word for the red abalone, which is the largest of the abalones and the predominant abalone in the Monterey Bay. And that word was Aulun, A-U-L-U-N. Then linguists have traced the word abalone all the way back to that word Aulun that starts right here in Monterey. And you see this piece here, this is actually bird bone, and bird bone is hollow. And then they'll create this design that we today would call scrimshaw, and they use squid ink to get that dark color. So you can see in the drawing here that she would wear them on both of her ears, wear it as a pair. And oftentimes they weave the beautiful baskets, they'll weave into the baskets, abalone shells, clamshell disc, olivella shell bead. So they were also hunters, heavily hunting in the Monterey area. I love this drawing. This was also done in the 1790s here in Monterey. This is the holder for the arrows. It's actually made out of a fox skin. That's what that thing is right there. And then, of course, they were heavily fishermen. I could say they were the first commercial fishermen in Monterey. And they're also, we believe, the first divers in not just Monterey, but in California. And we know that from burials that come out of the ground in recent years. And we cannot build a house along the Monterey waterfront without running across a Rumsien burial or two. The males have what's known as surfer's ear, which is a little bony growth because we open every ear if you're spending a lot of time in the cold waters like the Monterey Bay, which makes a lot of sense to me. You think if you see a big abalone the size of a hubcap, you're going to dive down there and get it. And then here's my good friend, Linda Yamane. Linda is a Rumsien descendant, probably the world leading scholar on the Rumsien people. And this is her and her Thule boat. This is actually at the Monterey Bay Aquarium and in their big tide pool out there. And then here she is again in her regalia with the abalone shell and all of her beautiful abalone pendants and all you see in the necklaces and the wonderful bird feathered headpiece you see right there. And then this is one of her baskets. Linda is the first Rumsien Ohlone basket weaver, we believe, in about 150 years. And she is probably the first Rumsien feather basket maker, we believe, in probably 300 years. And she's made a number of these feathered baskets now. They have one of her baskets on exhibit at the Oakland Museum, and another one at the Presidio Museum in San Francisco. This has been exhibited in Europe. Her basket, she is an extremely talented basket weaver. This took a couple of years to make. Again, you can see the olive shell beads here, abalone pendants here, and then the red feathers historically would have been acorn woodpecker feathers, but you just can't get acorn woodpecker feathers like they did those days. Plus, it's illegal. Although I think Linda could probably get a permit to get one, but it would actually take hundreds of acorn woodpeckers to give up their lives to get enough feathers to feather this basket. So she had to use chicken feathers, which she had to cut, and then spent a long time finding the right, experimenting and mixing dyes to get the right proper red color that you see right there. So this is a guy named Sebastian Vizcaino. So I'm going to guess a number of you out there probably don't know where Monterey gets its name. Well, I'll tell you that it does come from Mr. Vizcaino. Vizcaino was a captain, sea captain, and he was sent on a mission in 1602 by the Spanish government to sail along the California coast to find safe ports for those big galleons returning from the Philippines. And if you know that Manila galleon trade story, 1565, Spain finds a route that takes across the Pacific that lands right in the middle of Manila Bay. They got to Manila, they found out that Manila was like this gigantic Walmart, had all this really cool stuff from Japan and stuff from China, stuff from the Spice Islands, stuff those guys really wanted to have. And they had all the silver and gold from Mexico that those guys wanted to have. So they began trading, but they had to find a way to get home because you couldn't come back the same way you came because you're fighting these currents. It took them a couple of years, but eventually they found this route that pushed them across the North Pacific. There's actually a series of currents that'll push them all the way across. The Chinese called that the black tide, or the big train. Comes out somewhere near Cape Mendocino, Northern California. They turn right, set on the California coast, eventually getting back to Mexico. Well, this trip can be very dangerous. It can take weeks, sometimes it can take months. There's storms, there's diseases, there was scurvy, and scurvy was an awful thing. So you had to find safe ports. You got to stop and make repairs and take on fresh supplies and fresh water and just rest. And that was Vizcaino's job. He was outfitted with a special ship called the Caravel, a little galleon designed just to sail along coastline. He sails along this California coast, sailed into Monterey Bay in December of 1602. Had to be an absolutely beautiful day, or he would have missed this place altogether. He anchored his ship somewhere near where the breakwater ends out there, and he drops his longboats into the bay, into the harbor. There was a lot of water at that time in Monterey. This was December, remember. It was winter. There had been a lot of storms. There was snow on the mountains. There are scientists who say that we were in what they call the mini ice age at that time. And so there's a little stream that actually runs to the top of the Presidio in Monterey, still there today, that runs all the way into the Monterey Harbor. Today, that little creek is called San Jose Creek. But at that time, at Vizcaino's day, there was a lot of water in that little creek. And so he ran his longboats right up that little creek, and they actually camped up on the hill up there, spent about 10 days here. They were camped about, if you know the lower Presidio, there's there's a museum, the Monterey City Museum there. That's what where they're camped. This guy complained constantly about the ground squirrels getting into their food. They would complain about the cold and how at night their water bottles would in the morning there'd be an inch of ice on the top of their water bottles. Also, their little springs, every time they put poles in to put up their tents, this water would pop up, these little springs would pop up. But he loved Monterey, wanted to stay here, wanted to be named governor. But Spain had some other issues. They had some war issues and they had some financial issues. So they backed off. In fact, it took them close to 170 years to get back here. But imagine if you're those Rumsien families and you wake up one morning and you walk out of your little two house and you go out and you look out in the bay and you see these ships out there the size of a whale. I mean, it'd be like having a UFO landing in your backyard. Well, the Rumsien had a story they used to tell about a whale that swallows a man. The story goes, this whale was swimming from Southern California to Monterey. When it passed Santa Barbara, it swallowed this man. The whale continued swimming north. The closer to Monterey, the whale began to feel sick. The closer to Monterey the whale got, the sicker he got. Finally, the whale came to the harbor here. He's feeling so sick that he spit him out of the beach here near what now is the Monterey Wharf. When he swallowed that man in Santa Barbara, the man was brown. When he spit him out of the beach here in Monterey, the man is white. And that's how white people came to Monterey. But if you think about the story for a minute, you see some ships up there the size of a whale that's spitting out a white men in longboats onto your beach. It makes perfect sense. So this is another man. This is Gaspar de Portola, and Portola was actually commissioned by the Spanish government to go up and find the Great Monterey. This is about 169 years after Vizcaino was here. Vizcaino wrote wonderful descriptions about Monterey and kept a really beautiful diary. Not only did he keep a diary, but there were also priests who also kept diaries. By the way, I should point out that he had Carmelite brothers on his ship, Vizcaino did, and the name of Carmel comes from those Carmelite brothers, and the Carmel River comes from that name as well. So he wrote these wonderful descriptions, like a big giant postcard that sat on a big refrigerator somewhere in Mexico City for 169 years. And so Spain finally said, you know what, we got to go find that Monterey. And they were concerned that the Russians had come into the Pacific Northwest and maybe they're going to go down and find this Monterey first. And so this expedition was launched. And this Mr. Portola here, was in charge of it. But they weren't sailing, they're walking. Walking and sailing are two different things. And it was a long, arduous trip. They had to cut through all kinds of brush to get here. It was very difficult. They actually overshot Monterey, ended up near Salinas River. They weren't sure where they were. They thought they were close. And so Mr. Portola here sent a couple of soldiers by horseback, and they rode all along the beach from where the Salinas River was at that time. They could run all the way down. They actually did run into Monterey. They were on the beach, which is now adjacent to the Monterey Wharf. And those guys said, this does not look like that Monterey that Vizcaino had described. Well, there are reasons for that. Vizcaino was here in December. It was a heavy winter. There was a lot of water in the rivers. Portola first got to Monterey. It was in September. There probably was a drought going on at that time. There was not a lot of water in the rivers. So it did look extremely different. And so the soldiers went back, they continued north. The whole company continued north, ended up all the way to San Francisco Bay. The first to see San Francisco Bay, realized they'd gone too far, came all the way back, stood on that very same beach in Monterey, scratched their heads, so, I'm not sure if this is Monterey or not, killed a couple of donkeys to eat, then continued all the way back to San Diego, realized they were in Monterey, turned around and came all the way back, finally arriving here again in April of 1770 to establish Monterey. And for all that work, all that he did, they named the sardine after the guy. course, the whole big point of that was, of course, to establish these missions along California to Christianize the native people. Serra, of course, that was his job. That was one of the main reasons that they did that. Serra did not march with Portola, but of course came by ship. And when he arrived in Monterey, they held mass under a giant oak tree, supposedly the same oak tree that Vizcaino held mass under. This is, of course, a very romanticized painting of that scene of them holding mass under that oak tree. So here's a picture of the real oak tree. Here it is here. This was taken probably about 1900, early 1902 or so, after the tree had died. This poor tree had a hard life. It was hit by lightning in mid 1850s, but it survived that. In the around the 1890s or so, late 1890s, the city of Monterey was doing some trenching work. I think they're putting a new sewage system in, and they actually cut the roots of the tree and it died. But they kept it up there. It was very important to Father Mestras, who was the priest at that time of the San Carlos Cathedral. He was very protective of this particular tree. He actually put a little fence around it at one time. He was trying to protect it. This was actually taken before they put the little fence up there. A little metal fence that went around it. There's actually one there today, actually. And then early 1903, 1904, this statue was donated to the city of Monterey by Jane Stanford, who, of course, Stanford University. She was the wife of Leland Stanford. And initially, that's where that statue was going to go, was literally down there where that Celtic cross is today, at the foot of the, going into the Presidio, where the tree was. That's where it was going to go. And so some workers from City of Monterey were sent to go clean up the property so they could put the statue there. And so they just saw that dead old tree and picked it up and tossed it into the bay. Well, Father Mestras heard about this about a day later or so, and he was very upset and went to his congregation, which was made up of a lot of fishermen, at that time, mostly Portuguese whalers. And he said, could you guys go out there and find my tree? And so they went out in their whaleboat, found the tree about 25 miles out in the bay out there. It floated almost to Santa Cruz. And this is the best part, because it was a whaleboat. They harpooned it and then brought it back to Monterey. And part of it is still, you can go behind San Carlos Cathedral and you can see some of it there. So the statue was put down there initially, and the city was concerned about vandals. And so they actually moved it up here to the top of the hill there, where you can see it today. But this is all granite. I mean, they actually had to build what they call a steam engine, little donkey engine, and little railroad tracks. They had to pull it all the way up to be where it is. Because if any of you remember, was it not too long ago, during the time when they're going to the sainthood of Serra, some people were very upset about it, and some folks came in to the park one early morning and actually cut off the head of the Serra statue here. And for a couple of years, actually, he was headless, which I thought it was kind of cool, actually. I thought the city of Monterey could make some money that way, put a little ladder behind it, and they could put your head there, you could get your picture taken as Serra. They didn't like that idea. But they found the head. It was actually in the harbor there, and they had it repaired and reattached, and there it is today. But here is one of my favorite things. This is a chair made from some of the pieces of that same sacred oak tree. So a guy by the name of Harry Green. Harry Green was a pretty well-known guy here in Monterey, and he was a lover of trees. In fact, Harry was known as Tin Can Harry because he used to give to kids little tree saplings, and they'd be in tin cans, and they referred to as Tin Can Harry. And he was a lover of trees. In fact, he's really responsible for Arbor Day. And by the way, anybody who goes by Lake El Estero, and there's that little island in the middle of Lake El Estero, that actually is called Harry Green Island. Well, Harry Green picked up some of the scraps of that tree, and he went to his good friend Otto Sabaru Noda, a Japanese immigrant. Noda is really responsible for all the Japanese coming to Monterey. Noda is responsible for the salmon fishery and the abalone fishery in Monterey and California. And so he asked maybe Noda could make something with these branches. And Noda turned to his young nephew at the time, a young man named Ichiro Noda. Maybe Ichiro could do something with these branches. Ichiro was about 15 or 16 at the time. He came to Monterey about 1902 to help work with his uncle. And because Ichiro couldn't speak English, he sent him to school. And he went to Pacific Grove Grammar School, which is just the one school they had at PG at that time. So all grades were held there. And they actually had a football team. And so they actually recruited Ichiro to be on the football team. Here is a photograph of the PG Grammar School high school football team in 1903. Here is Ichiro Noda right there. And as far as I know, and I researched this, he is the first Japanese national to ever play American-style football right here in Pacific Grove. And here he is close-up of him in his uniform. So he was very proud of those chairs. He actually made 3 of them. They were made for Harry Green, and Harry was a member of the Native Sons of the Golden West. And they actually were headquartered at that time in the Custom House. And we believe that's where they were. One of those chairs, actually the one I just showed you, the picture actually was exhibited in 1915 at the Panama Pacific International Exposition. Ichiro here, when he was about 18, actually left Monterey, ended up in New York, went to NYU, and then he opened a concession stand on Coney Island and became very, very successful. And he actually became fairly wealthy. He left New York right before World War II broke out to go home to Japan to visit family, visit friends. And when he was there, war did break out and he was not allowed to leave Japan. He finally did come back to the United States in the 1960s when he was in his 80s. He came right here to Monterey. And he came to the Japanese American Citizen League Hall, where I actually am right now. And his one dream was to see those chairs. He was so proud of those chairs. He talked about those chairs all of his life, and they couldn't find them. So he never got to see them again. 2 of them have disappeared. They're lost in history. The one that I have, one I just showed you earlier, was found at the Custom House. It's now on exhibit here at Japanese American Citizen League Hall in our museum here. It is part of California State Parks. They have it on loan to us. They didn't know his own history till I told them about it. And then I've been in touch with the Noda family over the years, and we were able to send them pictures of that chair because they had never seen it, but they heard about it all their lives. So very proud of it. So all that work that Winipro Serra did too, I love this. This is an ad from the 1930s from the Monterey papers. It says, if Father Serra had blazed his trail 150 years later, he would have used a Chevrolet automobile. I'm sure that's true. So this is a man named Jean-Francois de la Perouse. La Perouse was a French sea captain and explorer. 1785, France started this large expedition into the Pacific. It was a scientific expedition. It was the first of its kind. Actually, part of what they really were looking for were whaling grounds. In those days, the 18th century, whales drove the world. Whale oil drove the world, and the French were big-time whalers, and they really were looking for whaling grounds. But it was a scientific expedition, and they were tasked to go into foreign lands and to collect specimens, to collect animals, to collect plants, to do artwork and make maps, all kinds of things. They came into the Pacific to spend time in South America. He traveled all the way up to the Pacific Northwest, spent time in Alaska. They had some problems in the Alaska area. They lost some sailors. Then he sailed down the California coast and came into Monterey on September 14th, 1786. He was the first foreigner, other than the Spanish, to visit Monterey, to visit Alta California. Of course, Monterey was the then northern capital for Spain at that time. And so he spent about 10 days here, and he had a number of artists with them. They had cartographers with them. They were collecting animals. They were collecting plants. In fact, anybody in the group who's ever been to Paris, there is a wonderful garden in Paris called the King's Garden. I've been there. It's a big, beautiful garden. And in that garden, in the King's Garden, there is a plant growing that was initially collected by the La Perouse group. And the popular name for that plant is called a beach rocket. I don't know what the scientific name is for, but it was collected by Mr. La Perouse. This is a map done by one of his cartographers of the Monterey Bay. You see it right there. This is a wonderful painting that was done by one of the artists that was with La Perouse. And this is depicting them visiting the Carmel mission when they were here. So you can see these are all the Rumsien people who were then living at the mission to greet him. And he wrote, La Perouse wrote in his diaries, he actually compared their life at the mission to that of a slave plantation that he had visited in South America. But the painting was left here in Monterey with the priests at the mission here. It's disappeared. We don't know what happened to it. But luckily, other artists came in and actually painted it. And that's why we have what we have today. But it was the original. We don't know what happened to it. But he also wrote wonderful descriptions of the Indian people. Here's a wonderful description he wrote in his diary of how they hunted deer. Their industry in hunting larger animals is still more admirable. We saw Indian with a stag's head fastened on his own, walking on all fours and pretending to graze. He played his pantomime with such fidelity that our hunters, when within 30 paces, would have fired at him if they had not been forewarned. In this manner, they approach a herd of deer within a short distance and kill them with their arrows. That's a wonderful description of them hunting. And so here is some quail. This is also an illustration that was done by one of the artists that was with La Perouse. And then they also collected these quail. Of course, they had to taxidermy them at that time to take them back with them. So they collected a number of things. They actually left Monterey after 10 days, and then they sailed directly across the Pacific, ended up in Asia. They were off the coast of China. And while they were in China, La Perouse met a British ship, and he transferred his diary at that point and some of the things they collected to this British ship, because he knew they were very anxious back in France. This was a big deal in France, this particular expedition. So he sent these things back to get there before they got home. He also sent a young lieutenant who was on his ship, but also with a number of things they had collected, left him off the ship where he had to walk from Siberia. They walked all the way across to Siberia back to Paris. It took him about a year to bring those things back. So La Perouse continued through Asia, ended up down through Australia, New Zealand, and then off the coast of the Solomon Islands. They got caught in some kind of storm and they disappeared, and no one knew what happened to them. It was a huge story in France. It was for many, for a couple hundred years. What happened to them? They don't know. It wasn't until the 1950s when they found the shipwreck off an island in the Solomon Islands right there. So I was in France, in Paris, about 10 years ago, and I went to the big maritime museum that's in Paris, which, by the way, La Perouse was the first director of that maritime museum. I went there to hoping I could find some things about La Perouse, and they did have a little exhibit about him. But I found this wonderful, beautiful coffee table book about the shipwrecks and about the artifacts that they found aboard that shipwreck, and a big, colorful book. And it was all in French, and I don't speak French, but I could certainly look at the photographs. And I'm going through it, and I look at this photograph, and look that I see right here. This is a red abalone shell right here. The only place you would have gotten this shell is right here in Monterey. And this is a French diver diving on that shipwreck here. So I was very excited about that. And so I kept that with me. And just a few years ago, actually before the pandemic hit, I contacted the French government, and all these artifacts are actually in a French museum in French Polynesia. They have all of them. And I contacted the museum, contacted the curators there, and we made an arrangement to send the shell and a few other things back to Monterey for the big exhibit we were going to have here. And working with the city of Monterey and the Monterey Library, my good friend Dennis Copeland, and we were all set. We're working with some folks in France, La Perouse Society in France. It was a really big deal. And then the pandemic hit and everything shut down. So unfortunately, it hasn't happened, but we're hoping still that we can still do it, because we did get permission from the French government to bring this stuff back. So we hope we can still do it right there. This is a wonderful drawing by a guy named Charles Scammon. Charles Scammon was a whaler. And this is a drawing he did of a whaleboat in Monterey. Portuguese whalers, Monterey, many of you may know this, some of you may not, but Monterey had a very active whaling industry here. California did, all mostly Portuguese whalers. These guys are all products of the California, or products of the big deep water whalers. Anybody read Moby Dick? This is kind of their story as well. Portuguese whalers were common on those big whaling ships. They were known to be great whalers, and they would sail those whaling ships out of Nantucket and New Bedford, would go on these long 3, 4, sometimes 5-year whaling cruises, and you wouldn't return home till you filled the holds of your whaling ship with whale oil, and it could take up to 5 years until you got home. Well, something happens in California in 1848. Gold was discovered on the American River, and all these ships come into San Francisco, including all these whaling ships. I mean, let's face it. Let's say we were all part of a whaling company out of Nantucket, had to smell dead whale every single day for the last 2 years. They told you there was gold up in the hills for the taking. What are you going to do? Heck with that whaling. I'm getting me some of that gold. That's exactly what these Azorean whalers did. They got to the gold fields. They found out that it wasn't as easy as they were told. They said, the heck with that. I'd rather be whaling. They go back to San Francisco, but they have no money because they didn't get any gold, and they have no way to get home because everyone abandoned their ship. So they were kind of stuck. So in 1854 or so, 17 of these Portuguese whalers were sitting at the pier in San Francisco. One guy goes, we're going by Monterey. Sure, it looks a lot like home. And there are a lot of whales down there. So he might have got down from San Francisco, set up a whaling station near the Monterey Wharf, and began whaling what they called the old-fashioned way, and little teeny 30-foot boats, like this one right here. 6 guys in a boat. So this is what's left of those Monterey whaling days here in Monterey. This is a big iron hook you see right here. And if you take a walk along the bike trail between the wharf and the Coast Guard pier, especially when it's at low tide, pay attention. You can look at, you'll see it stuck in the rock right here. So that bike trail, that walking trail that we all use today, actually is just landfill, right? So when the Southern Pacific built this right of way in 1886 to go from Monterey to Pacific Grove, really to go to the sand plant there, they blasted all that out. And there one time was a big beach right there. The Hotel El Monte used to use that beach for their guests, had big beach pavilions. Well, the whalers used to use that beach. They'd bring their whales in to Monterey Harbor, and then they would I think a picture, bring the whales here, and then they would go out and make the cuts on the whale, and then they'd wrap it up in these ropes and cables, and then run the rope through this eye hook. And then it would go into a big, what they call a capstan, like a big block and tackle. They'd turn that big capstan, and the whale will spin in the water, and the blubber comes off like a big orange peel. But that's still in the rocks out there, and you can still go see it if you just keep your eye out there. So here is a whaling station where these guys established themselves. And by the way, the name of that first Monterey whaling company was called the Old Whaling Company, and they called themselves the Old Whaling Company because they're whaling the old-fashioned way, right? And you can still see the sign over that door right there. So a couple of days ago, I was looking for something on the internet, and look what I found. Because they stopped whaling in Monterey, really they stopped about 1874 or so because kerosene came on the market, and those guys couldn't compete with kerosene. There was a company that continued to operate, I believe, strictly for the tourists that were coming to Monterey at that point. And the Hotel Del Monte actually hired them, contracted a company just to whale for the guests staying at the hotel, actually. So I found this on the internet. Look, Old Whaling Company, they're now making cosmetics for women, actually body butter. I don't even know what body butter is, but it's the Old Whaling Company. I don't know. These people are back east somewhere. I don't think they have anything to do with Monterey, but hey, what can I say? So here's our friend John Drake Sloat. I want you to hearken back to your fourth grade history classes or your high school social studies classes. Here's a term you may have heard called manifest destiny, from sea to shining sea. So the United States always had an eye on California. And so John Drake Sloat, all the commanders of the Pacific actually had standing orders. If the United States ever went to war with Mexico, they were to sail their ships into Monterey because, again, because Mexico had declared its independence from Spain in 1822, right? Although it took about a year for that news to get to Monterey. But then we became part of Mexico. And so Monterey was then the northern capital for Mexico. So they were under orders to sail their ships and take the town of Monterey. Sloat was off the coast of Mazatlan in 1846. It was in June, late June at that time, and he heard these stories that we had gone to war with Mexico. We kind of forced us into the war, by the way, off down on the Rio Grande, so he wasn't sure. I mean, he didn't have email at that time. He didn't get CNN or anything, but he sent his ships up. They sailed into Monterey Bay on July 1st, 1846, but he was still a little leery of this whole idea. He was concerned because just a few years before, he was another captain of the Pacific, commander of the Pacific, a guy by the name of A.P. Catesby Jones, who heard we were at war with Mexico, sent his ships up into Monterey, immediately sent his Marines in and took the town of Monterey, and only to find out the next day we weren't at war with Mexico and had to turn around and give the town back. So it was kind of embarrassing. So he was concerned about this, but he was finally convinced by a guy named Thomas Larkin, who was a local merchant here in Monterey, and then the only consul to Mexico from the United States at that time, that yes, we were at war with Mexico. And so on July 7th, 1846, he sent his Marines in and they took the town of Monterey, raised the American flag over the custom house. Now, Mexico knew we were going to do this. It was a bloodless coup at that time. They had already taken down their Mexican flag. So there wasn't any flag for them to actually take at that time. But they did have a war. We had to go on to war with Mexico. That went on for a few years. But at that time, as soon as he raised his American flag on July 7th, 1846, Monterey, along with thousands of acres of the West, became a part of the United States. It wasn't a state then, but it became a part of the United States. It was at that point right there. So here's our custom house. And we were so proud of that, but look, we actually made a sculpture of the custom house all out of apples. And there it is. This was actually exhibited at the 1915 Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco, right there. So if you know the story of Monterey, of course, they held the Constitutional Convention in Monterey in the fall of 1849. Monterey becomes a state in 1850. And when I went to sleep, it actually referred to those days as Rip Van Winkle Town, that town that went to sleep. But when they did, one of the myths about Monterey, that Monterey was the first capital, not just to stand in Mexico for Northern California, but also the first capital when California became a state. It never was the capital when Monterey became a state, or California became a state. Never was, and that was by design. So the signers of the Constitution initially went to San Jose, and then it went to Benicia, then went back to San Jose, and then eventually goes to Sacramento. And the reason that was because, they didn't want Monterey to be the state capital. And this is their words, that they felt Monterey was a Mexican town. They wanted to get away from that idea. And so there was plans, though, that someday they would bring the capital to Monterey. And so anybody who knows where the Del Monte Shopping Center is, that shopping center was not built until 1969. That property was held open all those years with the idea that they'd bring the state capital to Monterey, and that's where they're going to put it. So aren't you all glad that they never did that? Because this town would be a totally different place if they had done that. So all that work that Mr. Sloat did, they, in 1896, the Native Sons of the Golden West decided they needed to erect a sculpture to honor John Drake Sloat. So on the 50th anniversary of the Sloat landing on July 7th, 1896, they held a big event where they reenacted the whole Sloat landing. And there were a number of sailors who were with Sloat at that time who were there at the 1896 event. In fact, when Sloat Marines initially raised the flag, it got caught in the halyards, and a sailor by the name of of toller had to shimmy up the pole and unhook it. So they reenacted it. They had it purposely had it, the flag get caught in the halyards. And Mr. Toller, who was in his 70s at that time, was here, and he actually shimmied up the pole and unhooked it again. So the Native Sons of the Golden West began to raise money to build this sculpture to honor John Drake Sloat and what he did for the United States and California. This is a photograph of the unveiling of the sculpture you see right there. And so here it is. It took about 10 years for them to raise all this money. They raised it in increments to raise it. This is 1910. They finally unveiled it. And I won't go into all this because it's very symbolic, how many rocks are in there and how they did it. And if you go up to the hill and look at it, you'll notice that all these California counties are represented all around the base here. Special prominent people are around the base, and you'll see some are in bad condition, some are in good condition. That's partly because they use stonework from the different counties, and the city is looking to raise money to repair a lot of that right there. But if you look at the sculpture, at least it does to me, it looks kind of odd. You know, I mean, the eagle, they put this eagle, it just doesn't look right. Well, there's a reason for that, because the eagle wasn't not supposed to be there. Initially, this was supposed to be on top of that sculpture, was this. This is a sculpture of John Drake Sloat. And there he is, pointing down to the custom house right there with these big cannon all around the side here. But I had this vision as they put this up. Can you imagine? Every Monterey County high school kid would be hanging off these guys' arms and stuff at some point or another. So there's a reason why this didn't end up on that sculpture. So the artist who put the sculpture together, who the Native Sons of the Golden West had hired, was a French artist, and his studio was in San Francisco. And he'd been working on this for a few years. And in April 1906, there was a massive earthquake and fire, destroyed much of San Francisco, including the artist's studio and all the work he'd already completed, including this sculpture of John Drake Sloat. Well, as I mentioned, they took about 10 years to raise all this money. The base of it had already been finished, right? And so they didn't have the money to have them go back and rebuild this whole thing here. So the artist looked around and says, well, wait, I got this eagle. And so that's how the eagle ended up on the top of that sculpture right there. Of course, this is the 1st Squadron of the 9th Cavalry. This is the Buffalo Soldiers who came to Monterey early, 1903 or so. They came directly from the Philippines. Of course, Buffalo Soldiers are African-American soldiers. They came to actually build the Presidio. They're also marksmen. And what I love about this too, these guys brought, a lot of these guys were, while they're in the Philippines, married wives in the Philippines, Filipino women, and brought their wives with them to Monterey. And we think many of the first Filipinos that came to California came with these guys to Monterey. This is where they camped out. They did not live at the Presidio grounds there. Anybody know where this picture was taken? So I'll give you a hint. You can see the railroad tracks here. If we could go a little bit further out into this picture here, the Monterey Bay Aquarium be right over there. And so this actually is where the Andronico's market is today. That's where they were all camped out right there. And then they used, there's another building just down the road here there where they would go to recreate, take their meals and that kind of thing right there. But I think it was interesting when they were here, there were like sardine fishery in Monterey County was just sort of in its beginning stages. There were a couple of canneries operating at that time, and they needed really skilled labor, and there weren't a lot of skilled labor in Monterey, but these women, these wives of these soldiers were skilled labor and that kind of, and I believe that a number of them probably worked in those canneries as well. Also, the Buffalo Soldiers, when they left Monterey, these guys went up and became the first National Park Rangers at Sequoia National Park and Yosemite National Park eventually. That's what those guys did. All right, so Chinese fishermen arriving in Monterey in the 1850s. This is a wonderful photograph taken about 1874. This is all Chinese fishermen. This is on the village. It's down in Pacific Grove, Monterey area here. And if you look at the picture, you'll notice right here, these children were born here, American citizens. So what's important about the Chinese that came here, In the 19th century, most of the Chinese coming to California were mostly single men coming to work in the railroads, coming to work in the gold fields. These guys came to fish, and they came here like they knew what was here. Now, there are historians that I know who believe the Chinese are in California as far back as the 5th century. They certainly had the ships, they had the skills, they had the technology, so they could have been. We just don't know that for sure, and we probably will never know that for sure, right there. But they were really important because the Chinese really were the first to introduce the fisheries out there, showed us what was out there, how to really utilize that bay out there. They also created and developed the squid fisheries in California today. California squid fishery today is the largest fishery economically, fishery in California, created by Chinese fishermen. This is the Chinese squid boat. You can see the basket right here. They had learned years before that squid are nocturnal. You burn little pitch fires over the side of the boat just to attract them to the surface. They scoop up in these big baskets and bring them onto the beach to dry, and really created a whole industry here that still survives today. So when you go out, especially in the spring or sometimes in the fall, you'll see those boats out there with those big lights out. Those guys are fishing squid. They learned that all from these Chinese squid fishermen from the 19th century. And there's a beautiful picture. Monterey, as far as we know, is the only place where these guys brought their families with them. So that tells us they were here to stay. So this key right here, this very key, changes the history of Monterey forever. This is a switch lock key for the Southern Pacific Railroad. This is the key that turned the lock, that moved the track, that pushed the train to Monterey. Here's the railroad. And now with the railroad, now you got a way to get people come on the railroad. They got a way to get fresh fish to big markets like San Francisco. Now you got other folks coming to fish in Monterey, in particular the Italians, not the Sicilians yet, but the Genovese coming across the bay from Santa Cruz, coming down from San Francisco to fish primarily for rockfish. That's for the Chinese began to fish for squid. They want to compete with those guys. They said nobody wanted squid then. Squid was considered to be a junk fish. So the initial railroad that came to Monterey actually was a locally owned railroad called the Salinas Valley Railroad, narrow gauge railroad. They built that little railroad so they could bring fruits, vegetables, and grains from the Salinas Valley, from the Central Valley to Monterey. And so Monterey would be the hub where they ship them out of Monterey to other places. Also want to be able to attract tourism to the Monterey area, but they were not financially very successful. So they were bought out in 1880 by the Southern Pacific. When the Southern Pacific bought that little railroad out, they also bought about 8,000 acres of the Monterey Peninsula because they had this kind of quirky idea they could turn Monterey into a tourist paradise. Who would think such a thing, right? So here is a wonderful, wonderful painting of Monterey called City of Monterey, 1875. This is done by a guy named Leon Trousseau, the same guy who painted that sort of romantic painting of Serra holding mass. This is a wonderful painting. I think this is the greatest painting of Monterey that exists. Absolutely incredible painting. And you can see the railroad, Monterey Valley Railroad, coming in to the train station right here. You can see two whale boats in the water right here, pulling a whale right here. Here is the Pacific Steamship Company's railroad wharf right here, and the Pacific Steamship Company, which then was this gigantic conglomerate of steamships and railroads and all kinds of things. There actually was a rail track that went across the wharf here that they would bring the rail cars across with all the grains and whatnot and ship them out right there. Then you see the Del Monte Beach, right? What we today call Del Monte Beach, all filled with whalebone right here. Those guys are processing their whales over here on the beach near the wharf. Then because of the smell, they towed the carcass of that dead whale back into the bay. Then the currents, being what they are, would push the carcass of that dead whale onto this beach right here. Now you got a beach full of dead whale. What else do you think you're going to get down there? And they sure didn't smell very good. Big, giant grizzly bears come out of these hills. Will feed off the carcass of these dead whales because grizzly bears love to eat whale. And I've read accounts of people who lived in Monterey in those days, and they said at night they hear these grizzly bears walking through their neighborhood. Whenever anybody around here complain about raccoons getting into their garbage, forget it. But look at all the whalebone you see here. Then you see the wagon on the beach right there. So what that guy's got in that wagon, let's see if we can take a look at a close-up here. So in that wagon, look, he's got whalebone on the back of that wagon. So what do they do with all that whalebone? They're making stuff like this, the sale to the tourists. We're now coming to Monterey. Look at this, all this little of the San Carlos Cathedral, all made out of whalebone. You see right here, and with abalone inlay, and you see right here. They also used to make whalebone book covers. Then within the book, pages of the book were little pressed seaweeds that were collected by women, a group of women who lived in Pacific Grove, who were collecting seaweeds and pressing them in pages, made primarily for UC Berkeley at that time and the Cal Academy of Sciences. But I also believe they were doing it to sell to the tourists. There are a number of couple of groups that are selling these things to the tourists who are coming to Monterey. This is a Mr. Smith who had one of those businesses who was selling things to the tourists here in Monterey. By the way, his business was actually in the first theater, and you'll notice the sand floor that was there. And you can see all the whalebone products on the back right here, fancy rope work kind of things right here. He was doing all that kind of thing to sell to the tourists coming to Monterey, staying at the Hotel Del Monte right there. Here is an abalone spoon that you see right there. That was all the kind of thing they were selling. I love this because it says abalone shell, Monterey, California, April 1896. Probably bought this from Mr. Smith right there in his shop in the first theater. You see right there. And then I just really quickly, because there's sort of a myth about sardines, really a myth about Cannery Row. So how does Cannery Row become Cannery Row? There is Booth Sardine, you see right there. And there is a Booth Cannery. So Booth Cannery really is the only cannery that was in Monterey proper. All the other canneries are on what we now call New Monterey. And there's a good reason for that. So the sardine fishery really didn't take off until about 1915. Salmon was king before that. Salmon was the big fishery in California, in Monterey in particular. That's where it was. And they were catching a lot of salmon. In 1910, they caught 2 million pounds of king salmon in Monterey. 2 million pounds. Well, most of that salmon, about 90% of it was going to Europe, going primarily to Germany. And in those days, people in the United States ate a lot of sardines. They ate sardines almost on a daily basis, like we eat potato chips or crackers today. The sardines they ate were little sardines. Sardine is kind of a generic word. Almost all small survey fish referred to as a sardine. And what they catch in California is called the pilchard or the true sardine. And those are big sardines. So the sardines people were eating before the 1915 were those little guys coming out of the North Atlantic, coming from France. France was the big sardine producer turn of the 20th century. Well, what happened in the world in 1914? World War I cuts off all that salmon going to Europe and all those sardines coming from Europe, and they just switch and heavily began to fish sardine along the West Coast, in particular in Monterey. By the way, that Monterey sardine at no point in its history was ever a popular fish to eat. People thought it was just too darn oily. And so there were plans drawn up to build sardine canneries all along to capitalize on this. They wanted to build sardine canneries all along the Monterey waterfront. There are blueprints drawn up. They're going to build them starting about where wharf number 2 is today, all along the waterfront. Well, the folks at the Hotel Del Monte were very, very unhappy with this idea because they were convinced that if you build canneries along the waterfront, then the tourists weren't going to come to Monterey. And they had a lot of economic power in this town at that time. They passed a lot of these petitions around to try to stop this industry from even beginning, even developing. But the city of Monterey said, wait a minute, there's money to be made here. So they said, all you sardine processors could go way down there at the end of Ocean View Boulevard where nobody goes. And that's how Cannery Row becomes Cannery Row. And Mr. Booth could stay where he was because his cannery is already there. This cannery actually was built standing there until 1938 when he retired. Booth retired. He died in 1939. The city of Monterey tore it down in 1948. And there's really not much left of it. But some of the foundation is still there today. That's all that's left of it. Now, I love all these folks all dressed up. It must have been taken on a Sunday on their way down to the wharf. So Mr. Booth worked for a guy named Newt Hovden, hired a guy named Newt Hovden in 1906 to come work for him to manage his cannery. And Holden kind of revolutionized the whole sardine cannery idea. He brought in commercial dryers and commercial machinery, commercial sealing machines and things like that. One of the ideas he had was to put big floating pens out on the harbor, and until the fish would come up to the floating pens, drop their catch in the floating pen, and the fish would stay alive. And then when you need to go get them, they just in the canyon to get the fresh fish, they just go get them, bring them into the cannons, and they'd be fresh. Oh, well, you can imagine all those seals and sea lions and pelicans, or I had free lunch. But this lasted about a season. And I ran across a reference to those floating pens from a woman named Isabel Meadows. Isabel Meadows was the last of the Rumsien speakers. She grew up speaking Rumsien. Her mother was a full-blooded Rumsien Carmel Indian. And her father actually was an English whaler who came and jumped ship in Monterey. And she worked with a linguist, an anthropologist, a guy named John P. Harrington. And she told him that one of the big deals in Monterey in 1905 or so, 1906 or so, was everybody after church would go down to the wharf to look at the wheel of sardines. So I think that's what these folks are going down, to look at those wheel of sardines turning around in those floating pens down there. So I mentioned Otto Subaru Noda. He developed a Japanese fishing colony down on Cannery Row, present day Cannery Row. If you know Cannery Row, there's a big empty space down there between the El Torito restaurant and I forgot the name of the other restaurant next to it there. There's a big empty lot there that eventually going to put some kind of marketplace in there. And he sent for Japanese fishermen to create a fishing colony there. That's for the first Japanese LA divers in Monterey dove for abalone off that beach right there. In 1902, he built the very first cannery on what's now Cannery Row, Monterey Fishing and Canning Company. He worked with a American guy named Harry Malpas, and the cannery only operated for about 5 years. We shut it down in 1907. But this is a label from that cannery. This is probably the only one that exists. I have this on exhibit here at the J. Sell Heritage Museum. So as I mentioned quickly, as the Monterey sardine was never a popular fish to eat. This is the very first national ad for Monterey sardines. Appears in a Sears and Roebuck catalog in 1905. Down here being advertised as South, those are pickling spices, broiled mackerel. They were selling them as Monterey mackerel. But even in 1905, the federal government said, no, you can't do that. Though there's truth in advertising. You can't call them mackerel because they're not mackerel. So they marketed these fish initially to the African-American communities as salmon sardines, and they market them to the Jewish communities as herring sardines. They tried a variety of things to sell this fish. They used to produce these beautiful recipe books like this one right here. You go out to the canning, they'd give you one, they would mail you one. Or in those days, when you bought canned products, you bought them by the case, they'll put one in the case. This is all these great recipes. This is for breakfast dishes, right? Sardine on toast, sardine omelets. Who's had a sardine omelet? Come on. And a minced sardine on toast right there. You can't go wrong with that. And so very quickly, the sale of Monterey sardine, the World's Fair comes to San Francisco, called the Panama Pacific International Exposition. It was a World's Fair to celebrate the opening of the Panama Canal, opened just a couple of years before. And they put this World's Fair, if you know San Francisco today, where the Palace of Fine Arts is, that was built for that World's Fair. That was actually a big mud flat, and they filled it in for about 600 acres. All kinds of things introduced at this World's Fair. Every state was represented. California, the largest of the state buildings, all kinds of new products introduced at this World's Fair, including Monterey sardines. So here's a business card that I found on eBay. eBay was a museum curator's best friend. This is a business card for Booth Cannery, and I saw it at eBay. I had never seen one before, and it had some writing on it, and I couldn't read what was written on it from the eBay website. But I won the auction, and when I got the card, I could read it. It says near U.S. Fisheries Food Products Building Exposition. This is from that World's Fair. This is where Monterey sardines were introduced to the world right there. So I think I bored you enough. This is actually sort of, at another time, I will do the part 2 of this because there's actually a lot more to go. But I know I've taken enough of your time. So if you have any questions, I think we have a few minutes you can answer some questions, or you can email me at timsardine@yahoo.com. And thank you very much.